enabling the digital economy.
My name is Kathryn Taylor. I'm a researcher with the Cyber Policy Initiative at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Today I'm here to present a project that we're working on enhancing the cyber resiliency of smaller organizations, that long tail of cybersecurity of smaller financial organizations we discussed. And so I'll present some of our preliminary findings, our research, as well as at the end I'll present some questions we're seeking your feedback on to make sure this work is as valuable as possible. So who are we? The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace is a global nonprofit independent think tank. We have centers in Beirut, Beijing, Brussels, Moscow, New Delhi, Washington, D.C. My program, the Cyber Policy Initiative, like the Carnegie Endowment as a whole, is focused on mitigating and preventing systemic risk. So one of our main lines of work is on protecting the financial system against cyber threats. A few other lines of work I'll mention that you might be interested in are we work to strengthen the integrity of the ICT supply chain. We work on reducing software vulnerabilities, as well as reducing cyber risks to US-China nuclear stability. In our work on protecting the financial system against cyber threats, I'll mention just a few pillars of our work. We work with governments at the G20 and G7 level to promote norms to protect the integrity of the financial system against cyber threats. Second, we've launched a paper series with research on cybersecurity in the financial system with specific angles such as the national security angle, preventing systemic risk, the impact of the GDPR, as well as other topics. Third, we publish a monthly newsletter called FinCyber, which is a curation of news related to cybersecurity in the financial sector. And fourth, we're soon to publish a timeline of cyber incidents in collaboration with BAE Systems, cyber incidents affecting the financial industry. But the reason we're here today is to discuss the project we're working on the long tail of cybersecurity of smaller financial organizations. And this is in response to a call by the SWIFT Institute, which asked for researchers to identify actionable and achievable cybersecurity measures for smaller financial organizations. The audience here being organizations that are not connected to the SWIFT network. So smaller organizations like small banks, savings banks, credit unions, building societies, and others that are not connected to this ecosystem, especially in the developing world. So that's the audience we're looking at. So when we set out to do this project, we realized quickly that we didn't want to just publish a 30 or 40-page traditional think tank report. We wanted to be as practical and actionable as possible in putting forth our recommendations. Here's an example from the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, which put out this guide tailored to small businesses on cybersecurity best practices. And I think this is a really good example of something that's really digestible and tangible for cybersecurity. So steps here such as making sure that devices are set to auto-update, making sure that employees are aware of common signs of phishing, like spelling mistakes, logos that aren't quite right, spoofed email addresses. So this is keeping in mind documents like this for our end goal. So making sure we can get a document into the hands of a CEO or a chief information security officer at a small organization, and they can do something tomorrow to improve cybersecurity. In terms of our research process, we started with desk research of the wealth of existing guidance that is out there on cybersecurity. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel in terms of cybersecurity recommendations and best practices, but we are drawing from what's out there in terms of high-level cybersecurity guidance, cybersecurity for small businesses, cybersecurity for the financial sector, to make sure that we tailor that as best as possible to be really valuable for smaller organizations in a high-yield way. We're using expert interviews, discussions with a variety of representatives from government, from industry, from organizations like FSISAC and the FSB, to make sure that we do that tailoring, to make sure this is really impactful. And we've developed some drafts of guides and of our paper. And we're here at Cybos as part of a process of soliciting continued expert feedback from as many of you in the industry as possible to make sure we're hitting the target, make sure we're being as valuable as possible in our recommendations toward developing a beta version and then ultimately launching the paper in Q1 of 2019. So So I'll mention these are a few examples up here of guidance at a few different layers of cybersecurity recommendations and strategic thinking that are helping to influence our thoughts and that I'll present some initial findings on today. So documents you may have seen like the NIST Cybersecurity Framework or the EU's NIS Directive. These are high-level documents that are positioning cybersecurity as a mainstream priority for organizations and are helping to develop and promote organized, risk-based, continuous thinking about dynamic cyber risk. So making that a part of organizational priorities and giving some really helpful building blocks for thinking about cybersecurity. Then we have guidance like FFIEC's Cybersecurity Assessment Tool, SWIFT's Customer Security Program, FSISAC, these financial industry-specific things that are keeping in mind that the financial sector faces particular cyber threats in terms of volume and intensity and nature based on the fact that it is a particular industry. So combining that also with guidance for small businesses that are those really tangible levels of best practices, we can bring to bear different levels of thinking on cybersecurity to really help smaller financial organizations. So a few initial findings and analysis that I can present so far. That guide that I presented before, the NCSC's Cybersecurity for Small Businesses, was a really technical level, kind of CISO level guide of best practices for cybersecurity. When we zoom out and look at something like the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, this is helping to develop that continuous higher level organizational culture of cybersecurity in some really specific buckets of thinking. So can an organization identify where they stand in terms of the particular cyber threats they face and the risk posture that they have? Can they protect against the particular prioritization of threats that they have identified? Can they detect, so can they set up software and other procedures to have in place to make sure that they're able to identify when incidents are occurring along the threat vectors they've identified? In terms of responding, is an organization prepared to respond? So are they prepared not to be caught empty-handed when an incident does occur? Have they put in place protocols, communication lines, and other policies to make sure that response is second nature? And in terms of recovery, does an organization have an iterative approach to when a cybersecurity incident does occur? Do they treat responding as an iterative opportunity to improve cybersecurity? When we look at a document like SWIFT's Customer Security Program, over on the right here, this is highlighting that in the financial system, cybersecurity isn't just about you and your organization. It's you and your connections to the rest of the financial ecosystem. It's you and your connections to your customers, your protection of their data and their interactions, your connections to vendors and to third parties. So when you're contracting, when you're building those relationships, cybersecurity needs to be integral to all of those pieces, not just best practices at a technical institutional level. So when we move down to that more tangible level, NIST here has identified some best practices, drilling down on those higher level categories to make them actionable. So I'm highlighting this because in our research, we want to make sure we're not just providing food for thought on cybersecurity. This is important, you should think about this, here's how you should think about this, but what can you do? So in a category of identify, requiring individual user accounts for each employee. This is an example of how an organization might improve their ability to identify where threats and risks are coming from. That granularity where each individual actor in their ecosystem can be identified, and that increases visibility. In terms of protecting, an example is installing surge protectors and uninterruptible power supplies so that when an incident like a power outage or some sort of interruption happens, that an organization their data is protected and it's not all wiped when one incident does occur. Under detection, installing and updating antivirus, anti-spyware, anti-malware. That's a really good example of bread and butter cybersecurity, where an organization will be able to have systems in place to detect what's occurring on their networks. Respond, having a plan for disasters and information security measures so that an organization is prepared to respond. Recover, having backups really eases the burden of recovering from an incident. Having those data backups segmented away from the rest of the network will make it so that recovering is a lot easier. One more document I'll highlight here in terms of these layers of our findings and of our research is from the FFIEC. So this is the financial sector angle. So I'm just highlighting a few more dimensions here that we're making sure we include in this holistic thinking for smaller financial organizations on cybersecurity. One of those is governance. So a couple of pieces of that. Financial institutions are subject to different or additional regulations, policies, and other things in place on cybersecurity that what is required of them might be different and might be stringent on cybersecurity. So their posture on cybersecurity, the practices that you put in place, need to be aware of that context and of that regulatory environment. Governance within an institution is incredibly important on cybersecurity. So the awareness that cybersecurity isn't just the purview of the CISO, isn't just the purview of a couple of employees. It's really an organizational level priority, and it needs to come from that executive CEO board level in terms of organizational thinking. One more thing to highlight here on the financial angle, as I've mentioned, that interconnectivity. So best practices in relation to connections, to voluntary information sharing, building trust between organizations in the financial system, making sure those lines are in place, and escalation and reporting of threats. So all of that we're bringing into our recommendations and the way that we're presenting this forth to be as impactful as possible. So we're framing these initial findings in terms of the specific threat that smaller financial organizations face. So there are two sides of that. The financial side, the fact that they're part of a system that is a really high value target in cybersecurity. We're seeing cyber criminals targeting the financial sector for monetary gain as well as for informational gain, and that's a really big issue. The other side of that is that these smaller organizations are the least resourced in that ecosystem, and that they oftentimes then represent the weakest link in a system that is being targeted by cyber attacks very regularly. So with those pieces together, we're trying to see how we can bring the most practicable measures to prevent against systemic risk, to bring those organizations up and make sure that that long tail is secured. So in terms of framing and bringing these solutions to smaller organizations, we want to make sure that that's achievable on a couple of levels. So framing for smaller organizations thinking about cyber risk. Are they prepared to identify what their risk stance is, what threats they're facing? Can they identify goals and improvements to get them from their current state of cybersecurity to an improved state of cybersecurity? And then are they working to encourage and promote organizational level culture and thinking about cybersecurity as a priority at a high level, not just a niche topic? Then we bring into categories that make sense for smaller organizations. So that governance layer, education, connections, and dependencies in their system, as well as those cybersecurity hygiene measures within their organization. And in each of those buckets, as I mentioned before, those examples, bringing action steps that organizations can take along all of the lines that are most important to them. So how many chief information security officers in the room, raise your hand, feel that you have sufficient support and attention from your CEO on cybersecurity? Okay. So it's not every hand in the room, right? That's the point, is that we recognize that cybersecurity has to start and end at the CEO level to really be a part of an organization's operating culture. So we realized in our research quickly that our recommendations wouldn't just come at the CISO level, that we're putting together a CEO level guide that, one, positions the CEO as the leader of an organization's risk assessment and management in cybersecurity. So are they leading their organization to identify those threats, to develop plans, to have personnel in place, and to make sure that this is an iterative and continuous part of their organization's culture? Then the CEO as a leader of cybersecurity governance at their organization, putting the proper personnel in place, having a chief information security officer, having clear lines of communication established so that threats can be elevated and information can be shared, making sure that that is clear in terms of governance of priorities and of personnel in cybersecurity. And last, the CEO as the director of organizational culture on cybersecurity, making cybersecurity a part of overall risk management and thinking for an organization, making it a part of each relationship with vendors, relationships with connections, business decisions include cybersecurity. So then at the CISO level, we've developed 3 different guides. So one is that institution level cybersecurity, those bread and butter cybersecurity best practices that will raise the cyber hygiene we know is so important. Steps such as preventing malware damage, preventing phishing attacks, using passwords, et cetera. These are things that the CISO can implement and make sure that employees are trained up on. Then, because this is the financial system, paying attention to customer data. Customer personal data, financial data, and transactions are incredibly important and incredibly high value targets. So making sure that CISOs can make sure their organization has policies in place to responsibly handle customer data. And then we're also putting in recommendations that organizations can make to their customers to protect their own financial data and raise their own cyber hygiene. Finally, a CISO-level guide for protecting connections to vendors and to third parties. So the recognition that when an organization follows a certain standard of cybersecurity, and then they contract and share data with other third parties, if those third parties aren't also following the same standard of cybersecurity, it's compromised. So in contracting, in service-level agreements, in business decisions that involve sharing and flow of that data and of critical business assets, cybersecurity is a component. It's part of the conversation every time, and even a formal part of contracts. So that's the organization of how we're putting forth these practical level guides. I will be here at Cybos all week, and I'm really hoping to meet with as many of you as possible in the industry to seek feedback on our initial drafts. At the end of this presentation, I will share my email and the email of my colleague and co-author, Tim Moore, and we're happy to directly share some of the documents we've produced so far. And I would love to meet with any of you in person while I'm here. So I'll share a couple of questions that we're just still thinking through and would like as much industry perspective on as possible. So continuing to think through, what threats do smaller financial organizations face? How would you really drill down and characterize this from your experiences? Are you seeing that this is really just a simple lack of resources? Is it a lack of these organizations prioritizing cybersecurity? Is it a lack of information, lack of access to the guidance that is out there in terms of best practices in cybersecurity? Or is it when they have the information, there's some barrier to acting upon it? Is it some combination of those? What are your thoughts? And in light of those challenges, what should they prioritize? So what best practices have you found to be the most helpful? And what's your perspective on that? Looking more broadly, how would you characterize the threat that is posed to the overall financial system by the fact that these smaller organizations are vulnerable? How are you looking at that? And then what would be the most fruitful areas for improvement to mitigate systemic risk? And then finally, what mechanisms could larger financial institutions or other organizations use to help promote best practices and build capacity among smaller financial organizations? So we're thinking through all of this. We have a lot of thoughts and potential answers, but as much perspective as we can garner would be fantastic. So here's my email address and the email of my colleague and co-author, Tim Moore at the Carnegie Endowment. Please reach out. I'll stay around here and in the hallway after the presentation. And here's a link to sign up for our FinCyber newsletter if you would like to. Thank you all for your time today, and have a good one.